In this episode, we're going to zoom in on what we've discussed before about the different models of Christian theology and focus specifically on Protestant theology. And I mentioned that when Protestantism came on the scene, it shifted the epistemology by making Scripture the Supreme Court, the ultimate authority in deciding theological questions. However, there's actually two different models that emerged from the Protestant Reformation. So the slogan that Protestants came up with was the slogan of Sola Scriptura. Basically, the scripture only, the scripture is the foundation for all theology. However, there were two views as to which approach or what is the proper approach to such a theology based on scripture alone. So the two groups that emerged were the magisterial reformers, and these are the famous people like Luther, Calvin, Zwingli, and a group of other people that were the pioneers of the Protestant perspective. And the way they defined sola scriptura eventually, because at the beginning they argued that, yeah, theology has to be based on the scripture only. But with time, they kind of stepped back and they said, when we say sola scriptura, we don't mean the Bible only, we mean the Bible plus the early church fathers. And they said, well, it's not that the church fathers have authority, but they're just there in guiding interpretation. So, the regula fide, the rule of faith, the way the early church interpreted scripture is a guide to how we're supposed to interpret scripture. And the reason they did this is because they recognize that once they have the Bible out to everyone and everybody's reading the Bible for themselves, and they have this idea of the priesthood of all believers, then you have everyone just coming up with their own interpretation, and it's impossible to have any kind of consensus. And they say, no, you can't just make things up when it comes to interpreting scripture. You have to follow the rule of faith. So this combination between church tradition and scripture became part of the Protestant epistemology. So the church fathers, the early councils, the first 300 to 400 years of Christian tradition, orthodoxy, all these became components of the Protestant approach to theology. So that's one perspective. And then in contrast to that, you have the radical reformers. And the radical reformers said, no, we don't want any tradition in our epistemology. So we're going to take a strict view of sola scriptura, where the basis of theology should be the Bible and the Bible only. Okay, so what I'm going to do in this entire series of presentations from this point on is that I'm going to label the Protestant view of sola scriptura as pseudo sola scriptura, because it's not a true sola scriptura approach. It's not a true Bible only approach. And it's the radical Reformation version of sola scriptura, which I'm going to label the true sola scriptura theology in contrast. So pseudo sola scriptura is the Protestant one, and the radical one is the true sola scriptura. Now, the rationale behind why these two groups took these different approaches is that, if you look at how Catholicism viewed Christian theology, is that they viewed the church being continuously kind of following God's leading in the development of Christian theology. So within the Catholic mind, they were following the truth from the beginning, and they were still following God's guidance on the way to the present. In the mind of the magisterial reformers, the church was following the truth for a while, but then at some point around 400 or 500 AD, there was an apostasy, and the church veered off track and it went further and farther away from the truth. So when they felt the need to do a reformation, they didn't feel the need to go all the way back to the apostles. They only went back about 1,000 years or so, back to a more pristine time in church history. And then you have the radical Reformation, and they said, no, we cannot even trust the church fathers. So if we're going to have a Reformation, we're going to go all the way back to the time of the apostles. And because of that, we have to depend on the scripture alone. All right, so I want to recommend a book here in case somebody wants to see this perspective, not coming from me, but coming from Protestant theologians. And this is not because I think this book is particularly authoritative, or that Keith Matheson is somebody that's a key figure among Protestant theologians, but because this book represents the viewpoint of many different people I've come across within mainstream Protestant scholarship. And the way this book kind of materialized is that at some point, I think it was around the early 2000s, there was an increase of attacks coming from Catholics and Orthodox apologists. And also, there was kind of a wave of conversions of Protestant theologians that were converting either to Catholicism or to the Orthodox Church. And because of this, there was kind of a stir among Protestants to offer a response to these attacks and to this wave of conversions. And the argument from the Catholic side was that Sola Scriptura doesn't work for two reasons. The first one is that it doesn't work rationally, like theoretically it doesn't make sense. And practically it doesn't work because there's an enormous amount of theological fragmentation among Protestants. I mean, there's thousands of denominations out there, and they keep dividing and dividing and dividing. It's been 500 years. It's clear that Sola Scriptura doesn't work. So that was the argument coming from the Catholic and Orthodox side. And in order to respond to this, people like Keith Matheson started producing materials just like this book, where they made the argument that it is not the Protestant Sola Scriptura that's causing the fragmentation, but the radical Sola Scriptura that's causing the fragmentation. So they said Protestants don't follow when they say Sola Scriptura, they don't mean the Bible only. They also include early tradition. It's actually the radical reformers that had this idea they have to work with Scripture alone. And when you do that, what ends up happening is that you run into interpretational chaos. You come up with everybody kind of interpreting the Bible for themselves. That's why they came up with this term Sola Scriptura. So in other words, I'm doing the interpretation all by myself. And so that was kind of the response. So they said, look, if you want to blame the fragmentation on something, blame it on the radicals. It's not the Protestants' fault, because Protestant Sola Scriptura doesn't mean the Bible only. It does include that early tradition that kind of guides biblical interpretation and so on. Okay, so again, the point here is that it's actually mainstream Protestants that have come up with this idea that there's a version of Sola Scriptura that includes the Church Fathers, so it's not a pure Sola Scriptura, and there's a version of Sola Scriptura that's radical, that is supposedly pure, but what they said is that it doesn't actually work in practice because people end up interpreting the Bible in 1,000 different ways. And the argument is that this is how it's been since the Reformation. There's been the magisterial Sola Scriptura and the radical Sola Scriptura. So again, I'm not the one saying this. This is a prevalent view among Christian theologians from within the more conservative Protestant branches. Okay, so here's a graphical representation of what we've talked about so far. So on the left, you have anti-Sola Scriptura, which includes Catholics, liberals who don't take the Bible seriously anymore, the New Orthodox who say the Bible only points to Christ, other groups like maybe any other cults that have their own prophets, things like that. All those groups are anti-Sola Scriptura. Then you have the pseudo-Sola Scriptura people, which is the magisterial Protestant reformers and their descendants up to the present, who base their theology on the Bible, but also are guided by the Church Fathers and tradition to some degree. So that's the pseudo-Sola Scriptura view. And finally, you have the true Sola Scriptura perspective. However, and this one is the one that was introduced by Anabaptists and actually was later picked up by people like the fundamentalists, who also argue that the Bible is inerrant and you got to take it presuppositionally and not anything else. But the argument or the opinion of pretty much everybody looking at this approach to Scripture is that it hasn't worked. That basically the people that follow this approach don't have a functioning way to do theology, because when people come to Scripture and just focus on Scripture alone, they end up coming with all kinds of interpretation and things like that. Okay, so within this context, my question is, okay, all right, so fine, there's all these different views. People that have tried to do a true sola scriptura theology have failed, but does that mean that it's actually not possible? And there's a lot of people that will say, yeah, a true sola scriptura is not possible. But what I want to do is I want to figure out if that has to be the case. Is it necessary to assume that a true sola scriptura theology is not possible? Because if you really think about it, all the other approaches have problems as well. So it's not like, when we think about a true sola scriptura theology, we don't need to think of it in terms of being everything having to line up perfectly, because all the other approaches have their issues. For example, the Catholic approach, well, a lot of people just don't trust the church. And then, of course, which church is it? Is it the Catholic Church or the Orthodox Church that is the one that goes all the way back to the time of the apostles? Because each one will say, no, we're the right ones, right? And then on top of it, why exactly trust the church? Because it doesn't have a good track record if you're objective and you look at church history. The liberal approach, the problem with them might be that, hey, they have no real continuity with historic Christianity. In other words, if any of the apostles and anybody in the early church came back to life today, they would not recognize liberal Christianity as Christianity. It's too different. For the Protestants, the issue is, okay, the church fathers, we're going with the church fathers, which might not seem like a big deal, except that when you look at the church fathers, you realize that they were heavily influenced by Greek philosophy. Plato, Aristotle, Plotinus, all these different people had a significant influence on key theologians within that early era. So, you might say, well, I don't have a problem with that early philosophy, but at the same time, there's no reason to think those people were inspired. Like Plato and Aristotle, they weren't prophets like the prophets of the Bible. So you might say, well, I'm not really sure I trust that particular trajectory either. And then, of course, the fundamentalist approach, everybody already agrees that it doesn't work. So it's a failed approach. So there are reasons why somebody might say, well, maybe we should take a second look at a true sola scriptura theology to see if it's possible today. If it's not possible, there's nothing we can do about it. But if it is possible, we should be aware of how to make it happen, and we should be aware of what this theology would look like. So what I want to do is pick up the question of whether a true sola scriptura theology is something that can work. That's something that we can look at as Christian, as an alternative point of view next to all these other models that we've already described. And then when we ask the question, why is it that some people think it doesn't work? They might point back and say, well, it's been a failure up to this time. I mean, people have tried to do it and it hasn't worked yet. But consider that the people that have tried to do it have had their problems. In other words, the first people, the radical reformers, who were people like the Anabaptists, were heavily persecuted at that time in history, persecuted by Catholics and Protestants and civil authorities that maybe were not even connected with the religious authorities. And nonetheless, they persecuted this group of people to where they didn't have the opportunity to sit there and develop a theology like the magisterial reformers. I mean, people like Calvin, were they had the education and they had the opportunity to spend a large amount of time developing a systematic theology, while the radical reformers never had that opportunity. So we shouldn't blame them for not coming up with a successful method for doing a true sola scriptura theology. While the other group who picked up this perspective, being the fundamentalists are inherently incapable of producing such a theology because of their philosophical restrictions that they've put in for themselves, their presuppositionalism, their inerrancy, their anti-education, anti-intellectualism, all these different things, anti-science components that are part of the fundamentalist strain that have prevented this group or robbed this group of having the capacity to really produce a theology that works. So just because it hasn't happened yet doesn't mean that it cannot happen. So again, the question I'm going to be asking is such a thing as a true sola scriptura theology possible? even though other people haven't been able to do this so far, can we figure out a way to do it? So coming back to this graphic that I've used before, where you have the high certainty views, the hybrids, and the low certainty views of Christian theology. We have the Catholics who build on the church. We have the Orthodox who build on the church and tradition. We have Protestants who build on tradition and scripture. But is there a room for a theology that's based on the scripture alone? Because if there is, at this moment in time, this becomes an unused theological real estate that is sitting there right in kind of in the middle of all Christian theology that nobody has really developed yet. And when you think about it, when you think about all the different theologies that exist in modern Christian theology, I mean, you have liberation theology and Black theology and Hispanic theology and Asian theology and feminist theology and womanist theology and a million different types of theologies. And yet nobody has taken the time to do Sola Scriptura theology that's actually a Sola Scriptura theology. I think it's a significant thing to look into, because no matter where you are in the theological spectrum, scripture has always played a critical role in everybody's theology. Even the most liberal view scripture with respect because of its past. So the idea that there is no such thing as a true Sola Scriptura theology should be a concern for everybody, even for people that might not ultimately agree with such a theology if it did exist. They should still want to see it there on the table alongside all these other perspectives that people are proposing. So the scope of this series of presentation is to take a look at the possibility of a true Sola Scriptura theology and what it would look like. And again, it shouldn't be put on a pedestal and say, well, if a Sola Scriptura theology exists, it should be the perfect theology. It just needs to meet that threshold of viability alongside all these other models that already exist. As long as it's reasonable to the same degree that these other models are reasonable, then it should be a viable approach to Christian theology. So that's more or less the question I'm raising here. And in the next presentation, I will present a proposition for how to think about Sola Scriptura theology that actually has the potential to work.